Our life together was never perfect, but it felt solid enough, at least to me. I met Hannah when I was just starting out, climbing the ladder one careful step at a time, while she was already polished and ambitious. We worked for it all. The house, the car, the life. 2 daughters, Mia and Grace, were the glue holding us even tighter. But as the years crept on, cracks began to form in places I couldn't reach. It wasn't sudden. These things rarely are. At first, it was subtle. Late nights at the office, text messages answered with her back to me, vague smiles that didn't quite meet her eyes. I didn't press her because, well, life gets busy. I didn't want to believe there was anything wrong. Hannah's job as an executive assistant demanded more and more of her time. The long hours, the trips to conferences, the after-hours calls, it all built up like an invisible wall between us. I was doing everything to hold things together. Coaching Mia's soccer team, reading bedtime stories to Grace, making pancakes on Sunday mornings. I figured she'd come around when the dust of her career settled. Then came the company gala. It wasn't the kind of thing I wanted to go to, but she insisted. I'd wear my suit, shake hands, and try to make small talk with people whose names I'd forget by the next morning. At first, it was just another night to get through. But then I saw them. Hannah and her boss, Mark, standing too close, talking too softly. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe I was imagining things. But then Mark leaned in, touching her arm in a way that wasn't professional. It was intimate. The look on her face wasn't one I'd seen directed at me in years. My stomach turned to lead. I wanted to confront her right there, but something held me back. What would I say? I didn't have proof, just a gut feeling, and Hannah was good at explaining things away. I knew if I was going to get to the truth, I needed to wait, watch, and plan. That night, lying in bed next to her, I felt like I was in a stranger's home. I could hear her steady breathing as she slept, her hand resting carelessly on her pillow. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. That was the moment I decided. If she had broken the life we built, she would have to feel it crumble around her. The morning after the gala, everything felt normal. Too normal. Hannah hummed to herself while making coffee, flipping through her phone like it was just another day. I sat at the kitchen table, watching her, trying to figure out how long I'd been blind. She looked so calm, so put together. But every smile, every laugh she tossed toward the girls, felt like a mask. Big plans today? I asked, keeping my tone casual as I poured cereal for Grace. She grinned at me with a mouthful of Fruit Loops. Just the usual, Hannah replied without looking up. Mark has some meetings lined up. Might run a little late tonight. There it was. Another late night with Mark. My stomach twisted, but I kept my face steady. Don't work too hard, I said, forcing a smile. She glanced at me, her smile fleeting but just convincing enough. After she left, I sat in the quiet house, the girls watching cartoons in the other room. My hands itched to do something, anything. I wasn't going to sit there and let her lie to my face. Not anymore. I started with the basics. Her work schedule, checking her phone bills for odd numbers that came up too often, emails I could access from the shared laptop. What I found wasn't concrete, but it was enough to stoke the fire inside me. Late-night messages from Mark about projects, calls during times she'd told me she was in meetings. It wasn't proof of an affair, but it painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Then I remembered the gala. Mark had introduced himself with a smug handshake and a glance that lingered on Hannah just a second too long. His confidence had irked me then, but now it felt like a clue. I needed more. The next week, I started paying closer attention. I asked little questions, nothing big enough to make her suspicious. How's Mark as a boss? What's keeping you so busy lately? Her answers were always smooth, practiced. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. But there was a flicker in her eyes when I asked. Guilt? Or maybe just annoyance at being questioned. One day, when she was in the shower, I saw her phone on the nightstand. It wasn't locked, so I opened it. Scrolling through her messages, I saw a few with Mark. Nothing explicit. He wasn't stupid enough to put something incriminating in writing. But his tone, the way he addressed her, was too familiar. I put the phone back where I found it and stepped into the hallway. My heart pounded, my chest tight. It was all there, just under the surface. But she wasn't going to confess on her own, not unless she had no choice. That night, as she kissed the girls goodnight and headed off to finish some work, I followed her. Keeping my headlights off, I stayed far enough behind not to raise suspicion. Sure enough, she didn't go to the office. She pulled into a restaurant parking lot, her car sliding into the spot next to Mark's. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Watching from across the lot, I saw her laugh at something he said, touching his arm lightly. The same way she used to touch mine. By the time I got home, I had a plan. She thought she was in control, but she had no idea the game had just started, and I was ready to play. Over the next week, I focused on gathering as much as I could without tipping her off. This wasn't just about catching her, it was about preparing myself for what came after. I didn't want to lose everything, especially not Mia and Grace, because of her selfish choices. Hannah was good at hiding things, but no one's perfect. Every secret leaves crumbs, and I was determined to find them. Her work laptop, which she rarely let out of her sight, became my main target. She always logged out of her email, but her calendar wasn't password protected. Late at night, when she was asleep, I'd open it on the couch and comb through her appointments. Most looked innocent: client meetings, project deadlines, but there were gaps. Time unaccounted for. On a hunch, I decided to check her car. She kept it spotless, which made it easier to spot the oddities. A stray receipt from a hotel tucked into the glove compartment. A business card for a local flower shop with Mark's name scrawled on the back. Little things that might have meant nothing, but together, they told a story. One day, I called into work and pretended to be sick. After Hannah left for the office, I parked a few blocks away and waited. I hated sitting there, feeling like some kind of stalker, but I needed to know. Sure enough, just after lunch, she walked out of the building with Mark. They didn't look like co-workers. They looked like two people with no reason to hide. I followed them to a cafe on the other side of town. They sat in a booth near the window, leaning close, laughing like teenagers. Mark reached across the table, brushing her hand with his. I snapped a few pictures from my phone, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak. I hated that I still cared enough to feel the latter. When I got home, I printed the photos, staring at them until my vision blurred. I felt like a fool, a blind idiot who had let this happen under his own roof. But I wasn't going to let it break me. If she thought she could walk all over me and come home to play the perfect wife, she was wrong. I'd let her dig her grave a little deeper, but soon, she was going to realize she wasn't the only one with secrets. That evening, when she came home, I played my part. I kissed her on the cheek, asked about her day, and helped her put dinner on the table. She smiled at me like she had nothing to hide, like I didn't already know. Watching her laugh with the girls over spaghetti felt like a punch to the gut. How could she be so at ease? After the kids were in bed, she sat next to me on the couch, scrolling through her phone. I glanced over, pretending to watch TV. "You've been working a lot lately," I said, keeping my voice light. "Yeah, things have been crazy," she replied without looking up. "Anything exciting?" I asked, letting just a hint of suspicion creep into my tone. She paused, then looked at me, her smile tightening. "Nothing out of the ordinary." I nodded, turning back to the screen. Let her think she had me fooled. The truth was, I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I'd made sure she couldn't twist her way out of it. By the weekend, my plan had started to take shape. The idea wasn't just to catch Hannah, it was to leave her no room to deny what she'd done. I wasn't looking for a shouting match or empty apologies. I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal. Saturday morning, I told her I was taking the girls to the park. I needed an excuse to get her out of the house, so I could do some digging without interruption. Hannah smiled distractedly as she waved us off, claiming she'd be catching up on work. At the park, I tried to focus on Mia and Grace. They were racing each other to the swings, their laughter so pure it nearly broke me. How could I protect this, their innocence, their happiness, when the foundation it rested on was cracking apart? My jaw tightened. I couldn't let them lose the one stable thing they knew: me. After an hour, I dropped them off at a neighbor's house under the guise of running errands. I sped home, heart pounding as I pulled into the driveway. The house was quiet when I entered, but Hannah's car was still parked outside. "Babe!" I called out, keeping my tone casual. No response. I crept upstairs, ears straining. The faint hum of the shower reached me, and I knew I had my window. Her work bag sat on the bed, neatly zipped up. I hesitated for just a second before opening it. My hands moved quickly, rifling through folders and papers until I found her planner. Flipping through it, I saw appointments neatly labeled with client names and meeting times. But one entry stood out. Just a time, no details. Written in shorthand like a secret. Next, I checked her phone, charging on the nightstand. She usually had it locked, but I'd watched her enter the passcode enough times to memorize it. The screen lit up, and there it was, a string of texts between her and Mark. Mark. Can't stop thinking about yesterday. Hannah. Me neither. When can we meet again? I stopped reading, bile rising in my throat. This was it. The confirmation I dreaded but couldn't ignore. I quickly forwarded the messages to my own phone, making sure not to leave any evidence that I'd been there. The sound of the water shutting off jolted me into action. I shoved everything back into place, closing her bag and setting her phone exactly where it had been. By the time she stepped into the bedroom, wrapped in a towel, I was sitting on the bed, pretending to tie my shoe. "You're back early," she said, running a brush through her wet hair. "Yeah, the girls wanted to hang out with Sarah's kids for a bit," I replied, not looking at her. "Figured I'd grab some stuff for dinner while they're there." She nodded, her expression unreadable. Did she suspect anything? Or was she so confident in her lies that she didn't feel the need to worry? Either way, I didn't let it show that I knew. I spent the rest of the day going through the motions, pretending everything was fine. But inside, a storm was brewing. Hannah had no idea, but the first domino had already fallen. Sunday morning felt colder than usual, though the weather hadn't changed. The unease I'd been carrying settled deeper into my chest. Hannah went about her usual weekend routine, coffee in hand, scrolling through her phone while sitting at the kitchen counter. She seemed untouched by the storm brewing beneath the surface. I busied myself with chores, finding excuses to move through the house while keeping an eye on her. She looked calm, even cheerful at times, like someone without a care in the world. It was hard to reconcile that image with the reality I'd uncovered. Every time she laughed at something on her phone, it felt like a twist of the knife. Later that afternoon, I told her I needed to run some errands and drove out to a small cafe on the edge of town. It was quiet and out of the way, perfect for the next part of my plan. Over the past few days, I had gathered every piece of evidence I could find. The texts, the photos, even a voice recording from one of her calls with Mark that I'd managed to capture through a hidden app on her phone. It was all neatly stored on a USB drive, tucked into my jacket pocket. I spent hours in the cafe, thinking through every angle. Confronting her outright would feel satisfying in the moment, but it wouldn't solve anything. Hannah was skilled at twisting the narrative, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate her way out of this. Instead, I crafted a letter, a precise and cold outline of everything I knew. There would be no arguments, no justifications, just the plain truth laid bare. By the time I got home, it was late, and the house was quiet. Hannah was in bed, reading, her face calm and untroubled. She glanced up as I walked in, offering a tired smile before turning back to her book. It was strange to look at her and know what I did. The disconnect between the woman I thought she was and the woman she had become felt almost surreal. I stayed up late that night, finalizing my preparations. The USB drive was labeled and placed in a plain envelope, along with the letter. Tomorrow, the wheels would start turning. The next morning, while Hannah was distracted with the girls, I slipped the envelope into her work bag. I wanted her to find it later, in a setting where she couldn't escape the weight of what she'd done. As she left for work, I watched her drive away, feeling a mix of anger and anticipation. All day, I waited. I imagined her opening the envelope, seeing the evidence, reading my words. I wanted her to feel the same helplessness and betrayal I had felt. I pictured her trying to compose herself in her office, struggling to make sense of the situation. When she came home that evening, she was quieter than usual. Her movements were stiffer, her smile forced. She avoided my gaze, her usual confidence replaced by something more fragile. It was clear she had seen the envelope, but she didn't say a word, and neither did I. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't my burden to break. I had made my move. Now, it was her turn to face the consequences. The silence in the house became oppressive in the days that followed. Hannah carried on her routines, but there was a tension in her movements, a brittleness to her usually polished demeanor. She avoided meeting my eyes for too long, and her voice softened whenever she spoke, as though trying to tread lightly. It was a far cry from her usual confidence, and I couldn't tell whether it was guilt or fear that had shaken her. I didn't press her. I wasn't ready for the confrontation, not yet. The letter and the evidence I'd given her were only the beginning. Her reaction, calculated or honest, would dictate my next move. For now, I watched and waited. Hannah started leaving earlier for work, her evenings at home more subdued than usual. She spent less time on her phone and more with the girls, immersing herself in their activities in a way that seemed almost desperate. It wasn't lost on me that she was trying to cover her tracks, to regain control of the narrative. But it was too late for that. I'd already seen everything. One evening, I came home to find her in the kitchen, making dinner with Mia and Grace at her side. They were laughing, and for a moment, it looked like a snapshot from a happier time. But there was an edge to her laughter, a fragility that wasn't there before. It felt rehearsed, like she was performing for an audience. I busied myself with small tasks, giving her space while keeping an ear on the conversation. Hannah's attempts to reconnect with the girls were genuine in effort but hollow in execution. She asked them questions about their day, but her attention wavered when they answered, her gaze drifting to the window or the clock. It was as if she couldn't focus, too preoccupied with something else. Later that night, after the girls were in bed, I noticed her pacing in the living room, her phone in hand. She wasn't texting or scrolling, just holding it like a lifeline. Her face was pale, her brow furrowed. It was the first time I'd seen her unravel, even slightly. The weight of the letter was bearing down on her, and I let her carry it alone. The next morning, I checked her phone while she was in the shower. The message thread with Mark had gone cold. The last message was from her, short and curt. She had told him not to contact her again. It wasn't enough to erase what she'd done, but it was a start, a crack in the armor she had built around herself. At work that day, I found myself unable to focus. The silence at home, the lack of confrontation, it was all wearing on me. Part of me wanted to confront her, to lay everything on the table and force her to explain. But another part of me wanted to let the silence fester, to let her stew in her own guilt until it consumed her. When I returned home that evening, she was in the backyard with the girls, pushing Grace on the swing while Mia raced around with a soccer ball. She looked over at me as I walked through the door, her expression unreadable. I nodded at her, keeping my face neutral, and went inside. The house felt heavier than usual, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I knew this uneasy calm wouldn't last forever. At some point, the silence would break, and when it did, there would be no going back. The calm didn't last, and I hadn't expected it to. By the end of the week, the tension that had been simmering finally reached a boil. It started small, missteps in conversations, longer silences at dinner, and the way Hannah's hands shook slightly when she thought no one was watching. She was unraveling, but she was doing everything in her power to keep up appearances. Friday evening, after the girls were in bed, she didn't retreat to her usual spot on the couch. Instead, she lingered by the kitchen sink, staring out the window into the dark backyard. Her shoulders were tense, her back rigid. I watched her from the doorway, waiting, wondering if she would make the first move. But she didn't. She stayed there, silent and unmoving, until finally retreating upstairs without a word. The next day, she left the house early, saying she needed to run errands. I didn't ask where she was going. I already knew. She was running from the confrontation she felt looming, trying to find a moment of peace before it all came crashing down. While she was gone, I made my own preparations. The evidence I'd already shared with her was only a fraction of what I had collected. The photos, the texts, and the details of her clandestine meetings with Mark were all carefully documented and organized. I wasn't just building a case against her. I was fortifying my own position. When this ended, I wasn't going to be the one left in the rubble. By the time she returned, the girls and I were in the living room, sorting through old family photo albums. The sight of us together seemed to catch her off guard. She hesitated in the doorway, her keys still in her hand, before forcing a smile and stepping inside. She joined us, but her movements were stiff, her laughter hollow. The photos that once brought joy now seemed to haunt her. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, the tension became unbearable. Every clink of silverware felt like a hammer against glass, and every word spoken was too loud in the otherwise silent room. Hannah barely touched her food, her eyes fixed on the table. The girls, sensing the unease, kept their chatter subdued. After dinner, I sent Mia and Grace upstairs to get ready for bed. Hannah stayed behind, lingering at the table as if glued to her chair. I stood by the sink, washing dishes, my back to her. The silence between us was suffocating. She finally broke it, her voice quiet and strained, barely audible over the sound of running water. Her words weren't an apology or an admission, they were an attempt at deflection, a question meant to shift the focus away from herself. But it wasn't enough. Not for me. I turned off the water and faced her, meeting her gaze for the first time in days. Her eyes were wide, searching mine for some hint of forgiveness or understanding. But all she found was resolve. Without a word, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her alone at the table. If she wanted to confront this, she would have to be the one to do it. I was done carrying the burden of her betrayal alone. The next morning, Hannah's demeanor shifted. She seemed more restless, pacing around the house under the guise of tidying up. Her usual grace was absent, replaced by jerky, distracted movements. It was clear she was working herself up to something, but I wasn't about to make it easy for her. If she wanted to talk, she'd have to come to me. I spent most of the day outside with the girls, raking leaves and setting up a makeshift soccer goal in the yard. Their laughter echoed through the crisp autumn air, a stark contrast to the tension still hanging inside the house. Hannah watched us from the window, her expression distant. As the sun dipped lower, I heard the sound of her heels on the porch. She called out to the girls, telling them it was time to come inside and clean up for dinner. Her voice carried an edge, as though she was desperate to regain some sense of normalcy. When the girls were settled upstairs, Hannah cornered me in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed tightly, as though holding herself together. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was measured but strained. She asked if we could talk, her words clipped and hesitant. I gestured for her to sit, remaining silent as I took the chair across from her. The kitchen felt colder than usual, the space between us yawning like a chasm. She didn't meet my eyes, instead focusing on her hands, twisting her wedding ring in slow, nervous circles. Her words came in starts and stops, a jumble of excuses and justifications. She spoke about stress, about work, about feeling unappreciated. She painted herself as a victim of circumstance, someone who had stumbled rather than chosen to betray. But the more she spoke, the more hollow her words felt. She stopped suddenly, her voice catching. She looked up at me then, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. She said she wanted to fix things, that she still loved me, that we could get past this. It was a plea, raw and desperate, but it didn't reach me. I let her talk, absorbing her words without reaction. When she finished, the silence between us was deafening. She was waiting for something, anger, forgiveness, anything that would tell her where we stood. Instead, I stood and walked to the drawer where I had hidden the folder. I placed it on the table in front of her, my movements deliberate. The weight of it landed with a soft thud, but the sound seemed to echo in the stillness. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The photos, the messages, the timeline, it was all there, laid bare. Her face crumbled as she flipped through the pages, her breath hitching with every piece of evidence. When she looked up, her tears had spilled over, streaking her cheeks. Her voice broke as she tried to speak, but I didn't need to hear it. Everything she could say, every excuse or apology, was meaningless now. I stood there, letting her absorb the enormity of what she'd done, before turning and walking out of the room. There was nothing left to say. The moment for revenge had arrived. Everything was in place, the evidence, the leverage, and the element of surprise. Hannah thought her worst fear was me confronting her, but I had something far more devastating in mind. She'd taken our life and twisted it into a lie, so I would unravel hers, thread by thread. That Monday, Hannah left early for work, her usual practiced calm back in place. She hadn't said much since the night I handed her the evidence, but I could tell she was trying to gauge my next move. I let her wonder. Once she was gone, I made a series of calls. The first was to the resort where she and Mark had planned their next business retreat. It had been easy enough to find, tucked away in her carefully managed calendar. I explained the situation to the manager, an anonymous tip about inappropriate conduct between a high-ranking employee and a subordinate. They were surprisingly eager to cooperate, agreeing to monitor the couple's activities during their stay. The second call was to Mark's wife, Olivia. I had debated whether to involve her, but ultimately, she deserved the truth. I told her enough to confirm her suspicions and sent her the damning photos and texts I had gathered. Her silence on the other end of the line was heavy, but she thanked me before hanging up. I knew the fallout from that call would reverberate in ways Hannah and Mark couldn't control. Finally, I arranged for the girls to spend the weekend at my parents' house. They didn't need to be part of what was coming. I wanted them shielded from the chaos, kept safe from the mess Hannah had created. That evening, I was quiet at dinner, watching Hannah closely. She seemed tense, her smile brittle as she asked the girls about their day. She didn't look at me, and I let her pretend things were normal for a little longer. Friday arrived, and Hannah left for her business trip. I gave her a casual goodbye, keeping my expression neutral as she kissed the girls and walked out the door. The moment she was gone, I set the final phase of my plan into motion. At the resort, everything unfolded as expected. The manager called me late that evening to inform me that Hannah and Mark had checked in together and were observed behaving inappropriately. They documented everything, from their whispered conversations at dinner to the way they disappeared into the same room. It was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I sent the resort's findings, along with my evidence, to Mark's employer. I knew enough about corporate politics to understand how this would play out. Mark's reputation would take a hit he couldn't recover from, and Hannah's role in the affair wouldn't be easily swept under the rug. While they were dealing with that fallout, I made sure Hannah's private world began to crumble too. I intercepted her car keys and took her luggage from the resort staff, leaving behind a family photo with my face burned out. The symbolic gesture wasn't just for her, it was for me, a way of marking the end of what we had. By the time she and Mark tried to leave the resort, whispers and glances followed them wherever they went. The staff had accidentally disclosed their behavior to other guests, ensuring there would be no escape from public judgment. When Hannah returned home, her face was pale, her shoulders slumped. She stepped inside to find the house eerily quiet. The girls were gone, the family photos removed from the walls. On the dining table, I had left 2 items: signed divorce papers and a note that read, "You made your choice. Now live with it." When Hannah found the divorce papers and the note, the reality of what she'd done finally hit her. I wasn't there to see her reaction, but I could imagine it: the confusion, the panic, and eventually, the despair. For once, she would know what it felt like to lose everything. I had taken Mia and Grace to my parents' house for the weekend. They didn't need to witness the unraveling of their mother. My parents, though shocked by the situation, supported my decision. They knew I wasn't acting out of spite, but to protect my daughters from further instability. Hannah called repeatedly, but I ignored every attempt. Her texts came in rapid succession, ranging from apologies to demands for an explanation. By the time I returned to the house the following Monday, she was gone. Her belongings were still there, but the silence spoke volumes. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Mark wasn't spared the fallout. Olivia had confronted him in a very public way, exposing his infidelity to his colleagues and friends. She filed for divorce almost immediately, and the scandal reached their employer. Mark was forced to resign, his reputation in shreds. For someone who had built his life on power and appearances, the loss was devastating. As for Hannah, her professional world crumbled alongside her personal one. Mark's departure created a ripple effect, and whispers about her involvement spread quickly. Her co-workers kept their distance, and the opportunities she had worked so hard for vanished overnight. Weeks turned into months, and Hannah's attempts to reconcile became less frequent. She sent letters, emails, even tried showing up at my parents' house once, but I refused to engage. I had made my decision, and no amount of pleading would change it. Mia and Grace adjusted surprisingly well. They missed their mother, of course, but I worked hard to create a stable environment for them. I became both mom and dad, pouring my energy into making sure they felt loved and secure. It wasn't easy, but every smile, every laugh reminded me that I had made the right choice. Eventually, I found myself moving on. It wasn't quick or painless, but it was necessary. I met Claire at one of Mia's soccer games, a single mom with a kind heart and a quiet strength. She didn't pry into my past or try to fix me. She simply stood by my side, helping me rebuild my life piece by piece. Hannah's life, on the other hand, became a series of struggles. She lived alone, disconnected from the family she had once held. The career she'd sacrificed so much for no longer existed. The choices she had made, the lies she had told, they all came back to her, relentless and unforgiving. Revenge wasn't about public humiliation or destruction for me. It was about making sure the truth came out, about dismantling the illusion of the life she had tried to lead behind my back. She had to live with the consequences of her actions, and that was more punishment than any argument or fight could deliver. As I stood in my backyard one sunny afternoon, watching Mia and Grace play, Claire by my side, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. My life had been torn apart, but I had rebuilt it stronger, for me and my daughters. And Hannah. She would always carry the weight of what she had done, long after I had left it behind.